At Fort Mitchell's sprawling training facility in Georgia, the afternoon heat shimmered off the concrete as 184 recruits stood defeated around the infamous Titan course. Margaret Maggie Sullivan, 47 years old with silver streaks threading through her auburn hair, pushed a supply cart loaded with fresh towels and water bottles toward the sweating crowd. Her weathered hands gripped the cart's handles as several recruits noticed her approach. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Here comes Grandma with our participation trophies," sneered Corporal Jackson Hayes, a 23-year-old from Texas whose confidence far exceeded his abilities. The recruits around him chuckled, their egos bruised from their failures on the course that had just humbled every single one of them. "Maybe she can show us how it's done," added Private Kyle Morrison, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he gestured toward the intimidating obstacle course that stretched before them like a mechanical beast. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Vance, observing from the sidelines with her arms crossed, raised an eyebrow at the commotion. "You think our supply coordinator here wants to give it a shot?" she called out, her tone carrying just enough challenge to make the air crackle with anticipation. The laughter erupted instantly. 184 trained military personnel, all under 30, all convinced they were witnessing the setup to an embarrassing spectacle. But 23 minutes later, Margaret Sullivan stood at the finish line of the Titan course, a black blindfold hanging loose around her neck, having just shattered a record that had stood untouched for 8 years. The morning had started like any other at Fort Mitchell. Margaret arrived at 0500 hours, same as she had every day for the past 18 months. Her small Honda Civic pulled into the staff parking lot as the Georgia sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks. She wore her standard-issue gray utility uniform, the fabric comfortable but unremarkable, with M. Sullivan embroidered above the left pocket and Supply Coordinator beneath it. Fort Mitchell was a massive complex, home to some of the military's most challenging training programs. The Titan course sat at its heart, a brutal combination of rope climbs, balance beams, mud crawls, wall scaling, and precision jumps that had broken the spirits of countless recruits over the years. It was designed to test not just physical capability, but mental fortitude, the kind of course that separated those who merely wanted to serve from those who were born to lead. Margaret had walked past that course every single day for over a year. She'd seen the triumphs, the failures, the tears, and the celebrations. She'd delivered towels to the victorious and ice packs to the defeated. But to the recruits, she was invisible, just another middle-aged woman in a gray uniform pushing carts and restocking supplies. The irony wasn't lost on her. At 47, Margaret carried herself with a quiet dignity that most people mistook for resignation. Her auburn hair, now liberally streaked with silver, was always pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her green eyes, sharp and observant, seemed to take in everything while giving nothing away. She had laugh lines around her eyes and work-worn hands that told stories she never shared. The recruits had started calling her Grandma within her first month at the base, not to her face, usually, but loud enough for her to hear. It started with Private Danny Chen from California, who'd made a joke about how she reminded him of his grandmother, always fussing over everyone. The nickname stuck, spreading through the ranks like wildfire. Some used it affectionately, others with barely concealed condescension, but Margaret never reacted. She simply continued her work with the same steady professionalism she'd maintained since day one. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that Margaret Sullivan had once held the women's record on a course far more challenging than the Titan. But that was a lifetime ago, in a different uniform, with different responsibilities and a different name on her chest. This particular Thursday started with unusual tension in the air. The current training cycle was approaching its final assessment, and the Titan course stood as the ultimate test. Out of 184 recruits, only 23 had successfully completed it in the regulation time. The rest had failed spectacularly, some multiple times, creating an atmosphere thick with frustration and wounded pride. Margaret began her morning routine, restocking the medical station near the course with fresh supplies. She moved efficiently, her practiced hands organizing bandages, ice packs, and antiseptic with the kind of precision that comes from years of experience. The recruits were already gathering for their morning briefing, their voices carrying across the compound as they psyched themselves up for another attempt at conquering the course that had humbled so many. Staff Sergeant Michelle Rodriguez, the toughest-as-nails drill instructor from New Mexico, was addressing the group with her characteristic intensity. "This course has eaten alive stronger people than you," she barked, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "It doesn't care about your feelings, your excuses, or your participation trophies. It only cares about one thing. Can you push through when everything in your body is screaming at you to quit?" Margaret listened while organizing supplies, having heard variations of this speech hundreds of times. She knew Rodriguez meant well, but she also knew that the sergeant's approach, while effective for many, sometimes created more psychological barriers than it removed. Fear had a way of making people tense up, and tension was the enemy of fluid movement. As the morning progressed, Margaret watched batch after batch of recruits attempt the course. Private Sarah Kim from Oregon made it halfway before her grip failed on the rope climb. Corporal Mike Thompson from Ohio got tangled in the cargo net and fell hard into the mud pit below. Private Jessica Martinez from Arizona came closer than most, clearing the wall climb with impressive determination, but ultimately timed out on the final precision jump sequence. Each failure was met with a mixture of encouragement and frustration from the observing instructors. The recruits themselves were becoming increasingly demoralized, their confidence eroding with each unsuccessful attempt. Margaret could see it in their body language, the slumped shoulders, the nervous energy, the way they looked at the course like it was an unconquerable mountain. By noon, the heat had become oppressive. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete and steel obstacles, turning metal railings into brands and making every surface slick with condensation. Margaret had been making regular trips with her supply cart, ensuring that water bottles stayed filled and cooling towels remained available. It was during one of these trips that the confrontation began. Corporal Hayes, the young Texan with the outsized ego, was particularly vocal in his frustration. He'd failed the course twice that morning, both times falling on the balance beam sequence that required perfect coordination and focus. His pride was wounded, and like many young soldiers, he was looking for someone to blame, someone to take his frustration out on. "This whole setup is rigged," he complained loudly to his buddies as Margaret approached with fresh towels. "The course is impossible in this heat. They should postpone it until evening when it's cooler." Private Morrison, eager to impress Hayes, nodded enthusiastically. "Totally unfair conditions. I bet half the instructors couldn't do it in this heat either." Margaret began distributing towels, her movements unhurried and professional. She'd learned long ago not to engage with frustrated recruits unless they directly addressed her. But Hayes was just getting started. "I mean, look at Grandma here," he said, gesturing toward Margaret with a smirk. "Bet she's never even attempted anything more challenging than restocking a supply closet. It must be nice to have such low expectations." A few recruits chuckled nervously, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but unwilling to challenge a corporal. Margaret continued her work, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd dealt with worse than Hayes over the years, but there was something particularly grating about his entitled attitude. Private Ashley Brooks from Michigan, one of the few recruits who'd successfully completed the course, looked uncomfortable with Hayes' comments. "Come on, man, she's just doing her job," she said quietly. But Hayes was too wound up to listen to reason. "Just saying," Hayes continued, his voice getting louder as he warmed to his theme, "some of us actually have to prove ourselves out here." That's when Lieutenant Colonel Vance decided to intervene. She'd been watching the exchange from across the training area, and Hayes's comments had clearly crossed a line. Vance was a fair but no-nonsense officer who had zero tolerance for disrespect toward any member of her staff, regardless of rank or position. "Corporal Hayes," she called out, her voice cutting through the afternoon heat like a blade. "Since you seem to have such strong opinions about what constitutes a real challenge, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate the proper technique for our supply coordinator here." Hayes straightened up, suddenly aware that he'd attracted unwanted attention from a superior officer. "Ma'am, You were just running your mouth instead of focusing on your own performance," Vance interrupted, "which might explain why you failed this course twice today while others have succeeded." The area fell silent, except for the distant sound of other training exercises continuing elsewhere on the base. Margaret finished distributing towels, seemingly unaffected by the drama unfolding around her. But those who looked closely might have noticed that her movements had become more deliberate, more focused, as if she was centering herself for something. "Tell you what," Vance continued, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Miss Sullivan, you've been watching these recruits struggle with this course for months now. Think you might have any insights that could help them?" It was then that Margaret looked up from her cart, her green eyes meeting Vance's with a steady gaze that Lieutenant Colonel was only beginning to recognize. "I might have a few thoughts," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a confidence that seemed to shift the entire dynamic of the conversation. Hayes scoffed, unable to help himself despite his earlier chastisement. "What's she gonna tell us? How to organize our gear better?" Margaret turned to look at Hayes directly for the first time, and something in her expression made his smirk falter. "Actually," she said, her voice still quiet but somehow commanding the attention of everyone within earshot, "I was thinking more along the lines of showing you where you're going wrong." The silence that followed was different from before. Where there had been nervous energy and frustrated tension, now there was something else: anticipation, curiosity, and just a hint of respect from those smart enough to recognize that Margaret Sullivan might be more than she appeared. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Lieutenant Colonel Vance raised an eyebrow, her interest clearly piqued. "Are you saying you'd like to attempt the course yourself?" Margaret looked around at the assembled recruits, seeing the mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and, in a few cases, hopeful anticipation in their faces. She thought about the 18 months of grandma comments, the casual dismissals, the assumptions about her capabilities based on her age and position. She thought about the young soldiers struggling with self-doubt and the toxic culture of putting others down to build themselves up. Most of all, she thought about the course itself. The familiar rhythm of obstacles she'd conquered so many times before, in another life, wearing different colors but carrying the same determination that had never truly left her. "I think that might be educational," Margaret said finally, and for the first time since arriving at Fort Mitchell, she smiled with the confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove and everything to demonstrate. The Georgia afternoon sun seemed to pause in its relentless assault as Margaret Sullivan's words hung in the air. Lieutenant Colonel Vance studied the supply coordinator with renewed interest, noting something in the woman's posture that hadn't been there moments before, a subtle shift from service worker to someone who commanded respect through presence alone. "Educational, you say?" Vance repeated, her tone carefully neutral. Around them, the 184 recruits had unconsciously formed a loose semicircle, their earlier frustration replaced by curiosity. Even Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had stopped her paperwork to observe the unfolding scene. Margaret nodded, her hand still resting on the supply cart but no longer gripping it like a lifeline. These recruits are making fundamental errors in their approach. Physical technique, yes, but more importantly, mental preparation. They're defeating themselves before they even reach the starting line. Corporal Hayes let out a derisive snort. "Right, because a supply lady knows better than our certified instructors." Several recruits shifted uncomfortably, sensing the disrespect but unsure how to respond without challenging a superior. Private Brooks, who had successfully completed the course earlier, stepped slightly forward. "Maybe we should listen," she said quietly. "I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Do we learn something new?" The worst that could happen, Private Morrison chimed in, emboldened by Hayes's attitude, is we waste time watching someone embarrass themselves while we could be training. Margaret turned her attention to Morrison, her green eyes reflecting a depth of experience that made the young soldier unconsciously straighten. Training, she repeated thoughtfully. Tell me, Private Morrison, how many times have you attempted the Titan course today? 3 times, Morrison replied, his chest puffing out slightly. And your best time? Morrison's confidence wavered. I didn't complete it. Failed at which obstacle? The silence stretched uncomfortably as Morrison's face reddened. The rope traverses, he mumbled. Margaret nodded knowingly. Upper body strength isn't your limiting factor there. I've watched you bench press 225 pounds during PT. The rope traverse fails you because you're fighting the physics instead of working with them. You're trying to muscle through instead of using momentum and body positioning. A few recruits exchanged glances. Morrison's struggles with the rope traverse were well known, and Margaret's observation was uncomfortably accurate. Lieutenant Colonel Vance stepped closer, her interest clearly piqued. Miss Sullivan, you seem to have given this considerable thought. Perhaps you'd care to demonstrate these principles you're discussing. The challenge was issued politely, but everyone present understood the weight of the moment. Margaret looked around the gathered faces, some skeptical, some curious, a few genuinely hopeful that someone might finally provide the insight they'd been desperately seeking. I'd need to borrow some appropriate gear, Margaret said simply. These utility uniforms aren't designed for obstacle courses. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, pulling a standard training uniform from a nearby equipment bag. Size medium should work, she said, her voice carefully neutral, but her eyes showing the first hints of respect. Margaret accepted the olive-drab training fatigues, noting their familiar weight and texture. It had been 18 months since she'd worn anything like them, but muscle memory ran deep. I'll need a few minutes to change, Vance directed, then turned to address the assembled recruits. While Miss Sullivan prepares, I want everyone to consider what you've witnessed here so far. Respect is earned through action, not assumption. Keep that in mind. As Margaret walked toward the equipment shed, the conversations erupted behind her in hushed but animated tones. She could hear fragments of debate, some recruits arguing that this was a waste of time, others expressing genuine curiosity about what might unfold. Inside the shed, surrounded by familiar equipment and the scent of leather and metal, Margaret allowed herself a moment of reflection. The last time she'd suited up for physical evaluation, she'd been wearing the colors of a different branch of service, in a different state, with different responsibilities weighing on her shoulders. But the core of who she was, the part that understood the marriage of mind and body in overcoming obstacles, that had never changed. The training uniform fit well enough, though it hung looser than the tailored fatigues she'd once worn. She laced up the provided combat boots, testing their grip and support. Standard issue, but well maintained. They would. When she emerged from the shed, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Word had spread somehow, perhaps through the military's legendary rumor network, and additional personnel had appeared. Maintenance staff, kitchen crew, even a few off-duty instructors had materialized around the training area's perimeter. Master Sergeant James Kelly, a grizzled veteran who ran the base's physical training program, had arrived and was speaking quietly with Lieutenant Colonel Vance. Margaret caught his eye as she approached, noting his appraising look. Kelly had the bearing of someone who'd seen real combat, and his opinion carried weight throughout the installation. Master Sergeant Kelly said as she joined the group, "Colonel Vance tells me you have some thoughts about our obstacle course." "I do," Margaret replied simply. "Care to share them before you demonstrate?" Margaret looked out over the Titan course, her eyes tracking each obstacle with the focused attention of someone conducting a tactical assessment. "The course is well designed," she began. "Good progression of challenges, logical flow from one obstacle to the next. But your recruits are approaching it like a series of individual battles instead of a single fluid campaign." She pointed to the rope climb that opened the course. "They're burning energy on the first obstacle because they're fighting their own adrenaline. By the time they reach the balance beam sequence, they're already operating on reserves instead of strength." Kelly nodded slowly. "And you believe you can demonstrate a better approach?" I believe I can show them what happens when you treat the course as a conversation instead of a confrontation. Corporal Hayes, who had been listening with increasing skepticism, couldn't contain himself any longer. With all due respect, ma'am, talking a good game and actually performing are two different things. This course has humbled soldiers half your age. Margaret turned to face Hayes directly, and something in her expression made several nearby recruits take an unconscious step back. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep within. Corporal Hayes, in my experience, the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people based on what we can see rather than what we know. You look at me and see a middle-aged supply coordinator. What you don't see is irrelevant until it becomes relevant. The subtle rebuke hit its mark, and Hayes had the grace to look slightly abashed. But his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Then prove it," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier swagger. Lieutenant Colonel Vance intervened before the tension could escalate further. "Miss Sullivan, are you prepared to attempt the course?" Margaret nodded, already beginning her mental preparation. She could feel the familiar focus settling over her like a comfortable blanket, the state of controlled calm that preceded any significant physical challenge. Around her, the assembled crowd grew quiet, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "Standard attempt, or would you prefer to make it interesting?" Master Sergeant Kelly asked, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "What did you have in mind?" Kelly's smile widened. "The current course record is held by Captain Sarah Mitchell from last year's advanced training cycle. 2 minutes, 43 seconds. Think you can come close?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Captain Mitchell was legendary on the base, a former collegiate athlete who'd gone on to become one of the military's top physical training instructors. Her record was considered virtually unbreakable by anyone not already operating at an elite level. Margaret considered the challenge, her mind automatically calculating the timing requirements for each obstacle section. 2 minutes, 43 seconds was an aggressive target, requiring not just physical capability, but perfect execution and flawless transitions between obstacles. "That's a respectable time," she said finally. "So you'll attempt to match it?" Hayes pressed, clearly hoping to set her up for a spectacular failure. Margaret looked at him with what might have been amusement. "Corporal, I appreciate your confidence in my abilities, but I think we should establish realistic expectations." She paused, letting the crowd absorb what they assumed was an admission of limitation. Captain Mitchell's record deserves respect. Kelly nodded approvingly at what he interpreted as professional humility. "Understood. Would you like to do a practice run first, or are you ready to make your attempt?" "I'm ready now," Margaret said, walking toward the course's starting line. The Titan course stretched before her like a familiar adversary. The opening rope climb led to a cargo net traverse, followed by the notorious balance beam sequence that had claimed so many recruits. After that came a mud crawl under razor wire, then the wall climb that had broken Captain Mitchell's previous attempts, and finally the precision jump sequence that required perfect timing and coordination. Margaret took her position at the starting line, her breathing already settling into the controlled rhythm she'd learned decades ago. Around her, the crowd pressed closer, some hoping for success, others perhaps expecting failure, but all recognizing that they were about to witness something unusual. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez raced her stopwatch. "On your mark," she called out. Margaret's world narrowed to the course ahead, her mind automatically cataloging each transition, each energy expenditure, each technical requirement. She could feel her heart rate settling into the controlled zone that would sustain her through the challenge ahead. "Set," Rodriguez continued. In the moment before the final command, Margaret allowed herself one last look around at the assembled faces. She saw doubt, curiosity, hope, and skepticism in roughly equal measure. But mostly, she saw young soldiers who needed to understand that strength came in many forms, and that their assumptions about others might be limiting their assumptions about themselves. Private Brooks caught her eye and offered an encouraging nod. Even Corporal Hayes, despite his earlier antagonism, was leaning forward with obvious interest. Lieutenant Colonel Vance stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable but her attention completely focused. Margaret smiled slightly, feeling the familiar surge of controlled energy that preceded any significant challenge. She thought briefly about the young woman she'd once been, attacking similar courses with raw determination and endless confidence. Then she thought about the woman she'd become, tempered by experience and refined by understanding. Both versions of herself were present at the starting line, ready to demonstrate that some capabilities never truly disappear. They just wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. Go! Margaret exploded forward with a fluid power that surprised everyone watching. Her approach to the rope climb wasn't the brutal, strength-focused assault most recruits attempted. Instead, she moved up the rope with efficient, economical movements that conserved energy while maintaining speed. Her legs wrapped the rope with practiced precision, her hands found perfect grip points, and her body rose smoothly toward the platform above. She reached the top of the rope climb in 14 seconds, already faster than most recruits managed on their best attempts. But more importantly, she wasn't breathing hard and wasn't showing signs of the exhaustion that typically marked this early stage of the course. The cargo net traverse came next, and here Margaret's approach differed even more dramatically from standard technique. Where most recruits treated the net like a vertical ladder, fighting gravity and their own body weight, Margaret moved across it like water flowing downhill. She used the natural give and flexibility to assist her movement, never fighting the physics of the obstacle, but rather partnering with them. Halfway across the traverse, it became clear to the watching instructors that they weren't observing a lucky amateur. Margaret's movements showed the kind of technical precision that came from extensive training and deep understanding of biomechanics. This wasn't someone attempting the course for the first time. This was someone who understood obstacle navigation at a fundamental level. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found herself checking her stopwatch repeatedly, unable to believe the time she was recording. Lieutenant Colonel Vance had moved closer to the course, her professional interest clearly aroused by what she was watching. But it was Master Sergeant Kelly who first began to understand what they were really watching. His trained eye recognized the subtle signs of advanced training. The way Margaret's breathing remained controlled, the efficiency of her movement patterns, the complete absence of wasted motion or energy. As Margaret approached the balance beam sequence, Kelly leaned toward Lieutenant Colonel Vance. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I don't think we're watching a supply coordinator anymore." Vance nodded, her eyes never leaving Margaret's form, as the woman navigated the balance beams with a grace that made the obstacles look simple. The answer to that question was becoming clearer with each passing second. As Margaret Sullivan continued to dismantle every assumption the gathered crowd had made about her, her background, and her identity. Margaret's feet touched down from the balance beam sequence with the silent precision of a cat landing on carpet. Around the course perimeter, conversations had died completely. Even the maintenance staff who had initially gathered out of casual curiosity now stood transfixed, watching a display of athletic ability that defied every expectation they'd brought to the moment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stared at her stopwatch in disbelief. 1 minute, 18 seconds. Margaret was already past the halfway point of the course, and her time was tracking well ahead of Captain Mitchell's legendary record. More unsettling for the seasoned instructor was the complete absence of fatigue in Margaret's movements. Where recruits typically showed signs of exhaustion by this point, Margaret appeared to be just warming up. The mud crawl lay ahead. 50 yards of Georgia clay churned into a slippery morass with razor wire strung 18 inches above the surface. This obstacle had claimed more recruits than any other, not due to physical impossibility, but because of the psychological warfare it waged. The combination of claustrophobic conditions, disorienting mud, and the constant threat of the wire above broke down mental barriers almost as effectively as it challenged physical stamina. Margaret approached the crawl's entrance without hesitation, dropping into a low combat crawl that immediately demonstrated years of muscle memory. Her technique was flawless. Elbows driving forward, legs providing propulsion, body maintaining the perfect low profile that maximized speed while minimizing contact with the wire above. Private Morrison, who had failed this obstacle 3 times that morning, found himself leaning forward involuntarily. "How is she moving so fast?" he whispered to Private Brooks. "It took me 4 minutes just to get halfway through." Brooks shook her head, equally mesmerized. "Look at her breathing pattern. She's not even struggling." Indeed, Margaret's respiratory control remained steady throughout the crawl. Where most participants fought panic and exhaustion in the confining space, she moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had navigated far more challenging terrain under considerably more dangerous circumstances. Master Sergeant Kelly found himself mentally cataloging the technical details of Margaret's performance. Her elbow placement was textbook special operations. Her breathing control suggested advanced combat training. Most tellingly, her comfort level in the restrictive, high-stress environment of the mud crawl indicated someone who had experience with real-world combat conditions where such skills meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Colonel," Kelly said quietly to Lieutenant Colonel Vance, "we need to have a conversation about our supply coordinator after this demonstration concludes." Vance nodded absently, her attention completely absorbed by Margaret's progress through the mud. "I'm beginning to think we need to have several conversations," she replied. Margaret emerged from the mud crawl looking like she'd been dipped in Georgia clay from head to toe, but her pace never slowed. She moved directly to the washing station, a high-pressure hose designed to remove enough mud to prevent safety issues on the remaining obstacles, and efficiently cleaned her hands and boots while already assessing the wall climb that loomed ahead. The wall climb was where Captain Mitchell had historically lost the most time during her record run. At 15 feet of smooth wood with minimal handholds, it required a combination of upper body strength, technique, and tactical thinking that challenged even elite athletes. Most recruits attempted it as a brute force exercise, trying to muscle their way up through pure determination. Captain Mitchell had succeeded through superior conditioning and relentless training. Margaret studied the wall for perhaps 3 seconds, her eyes tracking something the observers couldn't identify. Then she moved. Her approach was unlike anything the assembled crowd had ever witnessed. Instead of the typical running start that most participants employed, Margaret took 2 measured steps and launched herself at the wall with perfect timing. Her initial contact point was higher than anyone expected, and her subsequent movements flowed together in a sequence that looked more like dance than athletics. She scaled the 15-foot barrier in 11 seconds. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the base, distant training exercises, equipment movement, normal military operations, seemed to pause in recognition of what had just occurred. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked at her stopwatch again, then shook it, then looked again. 2 minutes, 7 seconds, she announced, her voice carrying across the training area with crystal clarity. Margaret was ahead of Captain Mitchell's record pace by over 30 seconds, with only 1 obstacle remaining. Corporal Hayes stood with his mouth slightly open, his earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching awe. The precision jump sequence ahead was notoriously unforgiving, a series of platforms requiring exact timing and spatial awareness that had humbled Olympic-level athletes during cross-training exercises. Private Chen, who had made the grandmother comment that started the nickname, shifted uncomfortably as he watched Margaret approach the final challenge. His earlier joke felt increasingly inappropriate as he witnessed a demonstration of capability that redefined his understanding of what was possible. The precision jump sequence consisted of 7 platforms arranged in a complex pattern that required participants to leap between targets of varying heights and distances while maintaining forward momentum. The margins for error were deliberately small. A missed jump meant starting the entire sequence over, and the time penalties typically destroyed any hope of a competitive finish. Margaret paused at the sequence's starting point, her breathing still controlled despite having just completed the most physically demanding obstacles the course offered. For the first time since beginning her demonstration, she took a moment to study the challenge ahead, her eyes calculating distances and timing with the focused intensity of someone solving a complex equation. Lieutenant Colonel Vance found herself holding her breath. The first 6 obstacles had been impressive, but the precision jumps were where exceptional performances typically fell apart. The mental pressure of nearing the finish line, combined with accumulated physical fatigue, created a psychological trap that had caught even the most prepared participants. Margaret's first jump was perfect, a clean leap to the second platform that demonstrated both power and accuracy. Her landing was soft but confident, immediately transitioning into the setup for the second jump without wasted motion. Master Sergeant Kelly realized he was witnessing something that transcends normal athletic achievement. Margaret's movement patterns throughout the course had displayed the kind of integrated training that took years to develop and could only be maintained through constant practice. This wasn't someone who had stumbled onto exceptional performance through natural talent or lucky preparation. This was someone who had lived this kind of physical challenge as a way of life. The second and third jumps flowed together seamlessly, Margaret's body adjusting to each platform's unique characteristics without hesitation. Her spatial awareness was extraordinary, her timing flawless, her confidence absolute. By the fourth jump, even Corporal Hayes had abandoned any pretense of skepticism. Whatever assumptions he'd made about Margaret Sullivan, they were being systematically demolished with each perfect landing, each fluid transition, each demonstration of capability that exceeded anything he'd witnessed from his fellow recruits. The fifth jump required a backward leap to a lower platform, a disorienting maneuver that challenged depth perception and body control. Margaret executed it with the same effortless precision she'd shown throughout the course, landing centered on the target and immediately pivoting for the sixth platform. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found herself mentally reviewing everything she thought she knew about physical training and human performance. The woman navigating the precision jumps was displaying the kind of integrated athleticism that took years to develop and could only be maintained through constant practice. More than that, she was demonstrating the mental discipline that separated elite performers from merely exceptional ones. The sixth jump was the sequence's most challenging, a long leap to a narrow platform that required perfect trajectory and landing control. Margaret's approach was measured, her takeoff explosive, her flight path exact. She landed on the narrow target with room to spare, her balance never wavering as she prepared for the final transition. Lieutenant Colonel Vance checked her own watch against Rodriguez's stopwatch. 2 minutes, 35 seconds had elapsed since Margaret began the course. Captain Mitchell's record stood at 2 minutes, 43 seconds. If Margaret could complete the final jump cleanly, she wouldn't just break the record, she would shatter it. The final platform sat 12 feet away across a gap that had psychological challenges as much as physical ones. Participants could see the finish line beyond it, could hear the crowd, could feel the weight of expectation and the fear of failure at the last possible moment. The distance wasn't extreme, but the mental pressure of completing a near-perfect run often caused athletes to overthink the mechanics and destroy their rhythm. Margaret's approach to the final jump was different from her previous movements. She paused for perhaps 2 seconds longer than before, her breathing deepening slightly as she centered herself for the conclusion of her demonstration. When she moved, it was with a fluid power that seemed to compress all of her accumulated energy into a single, perfect expression of athletic ability. Her takeoff was explosive, her flight path was textbook, her landing was flawless. Margaret Sullivan touched down on the final platform at exactly 2 minutes, 38 seconds, breaking Captain Mitchell's course record by 5 full seconds. The impact of her achievement hit the assembled crowd in waves. First came the simple shock of witnessing a record broken by such a substantial margin. Then came the deeper realization that they had just watched someone who operated at a level of physical and mental integration that redefined their understanding of human performance. But for Margaret herself, the completion of the course seemed almost anticlimactic. She stepped down from the final platform with the same measured calm she'd maintained throughout the demonstration, her breathing already returning to normal, her expression reflecting satisfaction but not surprise. She walked back toward the group of observers, leaving muddy footprints in the Georgia dust. Her borrowed training uniform soaked with sweat and stained with clay, but her bearing as composed as when she'd begun. The crowd parted automatically to let her pass, but the silence continued as everyone struggled to process what they'd witnessed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez held up her stopwatch so Lieutenant Colonel Vance could see the display. 2 minutes, 38 seconds, she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. New course record. Margaret accepted a towel from her supply cart, the same cart she'd been pushing when this entire sequence began, and began cleaning mud from her hands with the same methodical attention to detail she brought to her regular duties. Miss Sullivan, Lieutenant Colonel Vance said, her voice carrying a new tone of respect that everyone present could detect. Margaret looked up from her cleaning, her green eyes meeting Vance's with quiet dignity. Thank you, Colonel. I hope it provides the educational value we discussed. The understated response somehow made the achievement even more impressive. Here was someone who had just rewritten the standards for physical performance on one of the military's most challenging courses, and she was treating it as a routine training exercise. Master Sergeant Kelly stepped forward, his years of experience with elite performers giving him insight into what the group had just witnessed. Miss Sullivan, if you don't mind my asking, where did you acquire that level of training? It was the question everyone wanted answered, but Margaret's response was measured and diplomatic. I've had the opportunity to work with some excellent instructors over the years, Sergeant. Good training tends to stay with you. The non-answer was itself revealing. Margaret was clearly unwilling to provide details about her background, but her performance had already answered the most important questions about her capabilities. Corporal Hayes, who had been conspicuously silent since Margaret's wall climb, finally found his voice. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions that were completely wrong. Margaret's expression softened slightly as she looked at the young corporal. We all make assumptions, Corporal Hayes. The important thing is being willing to revise them when we encounter new information. Her response was generous, allowing Hayes to save face while acknowledging his earlier behavior. It was the kind of leadership gesture that demonstrated emotional intelligence alongside physical capability. Private Morrison stepped forward hesitantly. Miss Sullivan, about that rope traverse technique you mentioned earlier, would you be willing to show me what I was doing wrong? Margaret smiled for the first time since completing the course. I'd be happy to help, Private Morrison. Sometimes small adjustments can make big differences. As she began explaining the technical aspects of rope traverse mechanics to the gathered recruits, Lieutenant Colonel Vance and Master Sergeant Kelly exchanged significant looks. Both officers recognized that Margaret Sullivan represented something much more complex than a supply coordinator who happened to be athletically gifted. The question was, what exactly had they discovered, and what were they going to do about it? The administrative offices of Fort Mitchell buzzed with an unusual energy as word of Margaret Sullivan's performance spread through the base's informal communication networks. By evening chow, every unit had heard some version of the story, though the details grew more embellished with each retelling. What remained consistent across all versions was the central fact. The supply coordinator had broken an 8-year-old course record by a margin that defied explanation. In her modest office tucked behind the main supply depot, Margaret sat at her desk completing the day's inventory reports with the same methodical attention she'd always brought to the task. The borrowed training uniform had been returned, cleaned and folded, replaced by her familiar gray utility coveralls. To anyone passing by, she appeared to be exactly what she'd always seemed, a dedicated civilian employee handling the unglamorous but essential work of keeping the base operational. But appearances, as the day's events had dramatically illustrated, could be profoundly misleading. Lieutenant Colonel Vance knocked on the doorframe, though the door stood open. Miss Sullivan, do you have a few minutes to chat? Margaret looked up from her paperwork, unsurprised by the visit. Of course, Colonel. Please, come in. Vance entered the small office, noting details she'd never paid attention to before. The space was organized with military precision. Supplies arranged in perfect order. Paperwork filed with exacting care. Every surface clean and functional. But now these details suggested something beyond mere professionalism. They hinted at ingrained habits that ran deeper than civilian employment. Quite a demonstration today, Vance began, settling into the single visitor's chair. "I hope it was helpful for the recruits," Margaret replied, her tone neutral and professional. Vance studied the woman across the desk, searching for clues in her demeanor. Margaret's composure was absolute, neither defensive nor eager to elaborate, simply present and attentive. It was, Vance realized, the bearing of someone accustomed to briefings and formal discussions. "Miss Sullivan, I've been reviewing your employment file this evening. It's remarkably sparse for someone with your evident capabilities." Margaret's hands still on her paperwork, the only indication that the comment had registered. "I prefer to let my work speak for itself, Colonel." "Your work today spoke volumes," Vance continued, "but it raised more questions than it answered. That level of performance doesn't develop overnight, and it certainly doesn't maintain itself without constant practice." A long moment passed in silence. Margaret seemed to be weighing her response carefully, considering how much truth the situation demanded. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a subtle shift in tone, less deferential, more direct. "Colonel, my background is my own business, unless it interferes with my duties here. Has my performance as supply coordinator been unsatisfactory?" The deflection was skillful, but Vance had expected as much. "On the contrary, your work has been exemplary. But today's demonstration suggests you're significantly overqualified for your current position. I'm curious about the circumstances that led you here." Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, and for the first time since Vance had known her, she looked like someone accustomed to command decisions rather than following orders. "Sometimes qualified people end up in unexpected places for personal reasons, Colonel. Life doesn't always follow the career trajectories we plan." Before Vance could respond, Master Sergeant Kelly appeared in the doorway. "Colonel, sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know. I've been making some calls about today's performance. The numbers Miss Sullivan posted aren't just impressive for our base. They'd be competitive at the Special Operations Command level." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Kelly's statement had clearly hit closer to home than the previous questions. "May I join this conversation?" Kelly asked, his tone respectful but determined. Vance nodded, and Kelly entered the cramped office, his presence making the space feel even smaller. The three of them sat in a triangle of mutual assessment, each trying to read the other's intentions. "Miss Sullivan," Kelly began, "I've been training elite military personnel for over 20 years. What I watched today wasn't just exceptional athleticism. It was an integrated tactical movement of the highest order. That kind of capability comes from very specific, very advanced training programs." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I appreciate the compliment, Sergeant." "It's not a compliment, ma'am. It's a professional assessment. And it leads me to believe that Margaret Sullivan, supply coordinator, might not be the whole story." The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of evening activities filtering through the window. Margaret seemed to be conducting an internal debate, weighing factors that neither officer could fully understand. Finally, she spoke. "What would you like to know?" The simple question carried enormous weight. It was an acknowledgement that her cover, such as it was, had been effectively penetrated. More importantly, it was a signal that she was prepared to engage in a more honest conversation. Vance leaned forward slightly. "Let's start with the basics. What's your military background?" Margaret's smile was subtle but genuine. "Army Special Forces, originally. Cross-trained with Navy SEALs for specialized operations. Ranger qualified, airborne qualified, various other certifications that probably aren't relevant to current circumstances." The casual way she delivered this information made it even more impactful. Kelly felt his own assumptions reshuffling as he processed the implications of her background. "Active duty?" he asked. "Was, for 15 years. Separated 3 years ago, with the rank of major." Lieutenant Colonel Vance found herself recalculating everything she thought she knew about her supply coordinator. "Major Sullivan, then, what brought you to Fort Mitchell in a civilian capacity?" Margaret's expression grew more guarded. "Personal circumstances, Colonel. Sometimes people need to step away from one kind of service and find another way to contribute." The answer was diplomatic, but clearly incomplete. Both officers sensed deeper complexities that Margaret wasn't ready to discuss, but they also recognized that she'd already revealed far more than her employment file suggested. Kelly leaned back in his chair, processing the revelation. "Major, that course record you set today, how does it compare to your previous performances?" Margaret considered the question. "It's been 18 months since I've run any kind of formal assessment. Today felt good, but I'm probably not operating at my historical peak levels." The understated response sent a chill through both officers. If today's record-breaking performance represented Margaret operating below her peak capabilities, then her historical standards were almost incomprehensible. "What was your specialty within the Special Forces?"
Intelligence and reconnaissance, primarily. But Special Forces training tends to be comprehensive. We were expected to adapt to whatever mission requirements demanded. Kelly nodded knowingly. Special Forces officers were among the most versatile military personnel, trained to operate independently in complex, high-stress environments. The skill set translated perfectly to obstacle course performance, but it also suggested capabilities that extended far beyond physical training. "Major Sullivan," Vance said, using Margaret's former rank for the first time, "I have to ask, why are you working as a supply coordinator? Someone with your background could easily secure a position as an instructor, consultant, or contractor at significantly higher compensation." Margaret's pause was longer this time, and when she answered, her voice carried a note of vulnerability that hadn't been present before. "Colonel, sometimes people need to find ways to serve that don't require them to be in the spotlight. Sometimes the best contribution someone can make is to do essential work without recognition or advancement. Sometimes that's exactly what they need." The explanation hinted at deeper personal factors without revealing specifics. Both officers recognized that Margaret was sharing as much as she was comfortable with, and that pushing for more details might damage the trust she was extending. A knock on the doorframe interrupted the conversation. Private Brooks stood at the entrance, looking nervous but determined. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to thank you for what you did today, and I was wondering, would you be willing to provide some training advice, not just for me, but for some of the other recruits who are struggling with the course?" Margaret looked at Brooks with genuine warmth. "Of course, Private. I'd be happy to help however I can." Brooks smiled gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am. Also, I wanted you to know, some of the recruits have been talking, and we all agree that what happened today was incredible. You've changed how we think about a lot of things." After Brooks left, the office fell quiet again. Margaret's willingness to help the recruits had revealed another dimension of her character, a natural inclination toward mentorship and development that suggested leadership experience beyond what she'd already disclosed. "Major," Kelly said thoughtfully, "would you consider taking on a more formal training role here at Fort Mitchell? Your expertise could benefit a lot more people than just our current recruit cycle." Margaret shook her head gently. "I appreciate the offer, Sergeant, but I'm content with my current position. Sometimes the best way to help people is from exactly where you are." Vance studied Margaret's expression, sensing layers of complexity that would take time to understand fully. "Major Sullivan, I want you to know that your secret is safe with us, but I also want you to know that if circumstances change, if you ever want to discuss other opportunities, my door is always open." Margaret nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Colonel. That means more than you might realize." As the two officers prepared to leave, Kelly turned back with one final question. "Major, that course record you set today, do you think any of our current recruits have the potential to match it?" Margaret smiled, and for the first time, it was the confident expression of someone who had spent years developing elite military personnel. "Sergeant, I think you'd be surprised what people can accomplish when they understand their own capabilities and receive proper guidance. The potential is often there. It just needs the right circumstances to emerge." After Vance and Kelly departed, Margaret sat alone in her office, surrounded by the familiar trappings of her civilian job, but knowing that her carefully maintained anonymity had been permanently altered. The conversation had been inevitable from the moment she decided to demonstrate her capabilities, but that didn't make the transition any less complex. She thought about the recruits she'd observed struggling with the course, remembering her own early days in military training, when everything seemed impossible until suddenly it wasn't. She thought about the officers who had just discovered her background, wondering how this revelation might change the dynamics of her work environment. Most of all, she thought about the choices that had brought her to Fort Mitchell, and the new choices she might need to make now that her past had caught up with her present. Outside her window, the base settled into its evening rhythm. In the barracks, recruits were probably still discussing the day's events, trying to process what they'd witnessed and what it meant for their own training. In the officers' quarters, Vance and Kelly were likely having their own conversations about how to handle their discovery. But in her small office behind the supply depot, Major Margaret Sullivan, still officially Mrs. Sullivan, supply coordinator, returned to her inventory reports, maintaining the precise attention to detail that had characterized both versions of her service career. Some things, after all, never changed, even when everything else did. The morning after Margaret's revelation brought unexpected changes to Fort Mitchell's routine. Word of her military background had spread through the officer corps overnight, creating a subtle but noticeable shift in how base personnel interacted with the woman they'd previously seen as simply another civilian employee. Captain Rebecca Torres, the base's physical training coordinator, stood outside the supply depot at 0630 hours, holding a steaming cup of coffee and waiting for Margaret to arrive for work. Torres had served 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan and had deep respect for Special Forces operators, having worked alongside them during particularly challenging missions. Margaret appeared precisely at her usual time, unlocking the depot with the same efficiency she brought to all her tasks. Torres noticed Torres immediately, but gave no indication of surprise or concern. "Captain Torres," Margaret said with a polite nod, "you're up early this morning." "Major Sullivan," Torres replied, using Margaret's former rank without hesitation. "I was hoping we could talk before the day gets too busy." Margaret paused in her unlocking routine, keys still in her hand. The use of her military rank marked a permanent shift in how she would be perceived on base, regardless of her current civilian status. "Of course," Margaret said, opening the depot door. "Would you like to come in?" Torres followed her into the organized warehouse space, noting the military precision with which everything was arranged. Supply categories were clearly marked, inventory systems were color-coded for efficiency, and not a single item appeared out of place.
"Major, I'll be direct," Torres began. "I've been running PT programs on this base for 3 years, and yesterday was the first time I've seen someone perform at that level. But more than that, I recognize the training methodology you demonstrated. It's not just about physical capability, it's about integrated tactical thinking." Margaret began her morning routine of checking overnight delivery logs, but her attention was clearly focused on the conversation. "What can I do for you, Captain? I have 63 recruits in my current cycle who are struggling with the Titan course. After watching your demonstration yesterday, I believe they're failing because they're approaching it wrong. They need someone who understands the mental component of elite performance." Margaret set down her clipboard and looked directly at Torres. "Captain, I appreciate what you're suggesting, but I'm not looking to return to an instructional role." "I'm not asking you to return to anything," Torres clarified. "I'm asking you to help these recruits discover capabilities they don't know they have. 37 of them are on track to wash out of the program entirely if they can't master the course." The number hit Margaret harder than Torres had expected. 37 young people were facing the end of their military aspirations because they couldn't overcome a physical and mental challenge that Margaret knew was entirely surmountable with proper guidance. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Informal mentoring. Maybe an hour in the evenings, working with small groups who volunteer for additional training. Nothing official, nothing that would compromise your current position." Margaret considered the proposal while reviewing the morning's supply requisitions. The idea of helping struggling recruits appealed to her natural mentoring instincts, but it also represented a step back toward the military life she'd deliberately left behind. "Let me think about it," she said finally. Torres nodded, recognizing that pushing harder would be counterproductive. "Fair enough, but Major, those recruits saw something yesterday that changed how they think about their own potential. That's worth preserving." After Torres left, Margaret found herself unable to concentrate fully on her routine tasks.
The conversation had stirred something she'd been carefully keeping dormant, the satisfaction that came from developing others' capabilities and watching them achieve things they'd thought impossible. By mid-morning, the first of several unexpected visitors appeared at the depot. Corporal Hayes, the young Texan who had been most vocal in his initial skepticism, stood nervously in the doorway. "Ma'am," he said formally, "I was wondering if I could speak with you privately." Margaret gestured him inside, noting the significant change in his demeanor since their previous interaction. Gone was the casual arrogance, replaced by genuine respect and what appeared to be considerable embarrassment. "Major Sullivan," Hayes began, using her rank without prompting, "I owe you more than just an apology. I was completely out of line yesterday, and I want you to know that I understand how wrong I was." Margaret listened without interrupting, allowing Hayes to work through what was clearly a prepared statement. "But more than that," he continued, "I realize that I've been approaching everything here with the wrong attitude. Watching you yesterday made me understand that I don't know nearly as much as I thought I did about what makes someone capable or valuable." The young corporal's sincerity was evident, and Margaret found herself reminded of similar conversations she'd had with junior officers during her active duty career. Pride and humility were constant companions in military development, and learning to balance them was part of growing into effective leadership. "Corporal Hayes," Margaret said gently, "yesterday was about demonstrating that assumptions can be limiting, for the recruits watching, but also for you. What matters now is what you do with that understanding." Hayes nodded earnestly. "Yes, ma'am. I was actually hoping you might be willing to provide some guidance, not just about the course, but about the mental approach to training. I feel like I've been doing everything the hard way." Margaret studied the young soldier, seeing genuine desire for improvement beneath his request. "What specific areas are you struggling with?" "Honestly, all of it. I keep failing because I get frustrated and try to force my way through obstacles instead of thinking them through. Watching you yesterday, it was like you were having a conversation with the course instead of fighting it." The observation was surprisingly sophisticated, suggesting that Hayes had been paying closer attention than his earlier behavior indicated. "That's actually an excellent way to think about it," Margaret said. "Physical challenges are problems to be solved, not enemies to be defeated. When you approach them with curiosity instead of aggression, you often find solutions you couldn't see before." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Private Morrison, who appeared equally nervous but determined. Behind him stood Private Chen, the recruit whose grandmother comment had started the grandma nickname. "Ma'am," Morrison said, "we heard Corporal Hayes was here, and we were hoping we could join the conversation, if that's okay." Margaret looked at the three young soldiers, recognizing the kind of informal learning group that often formed around challenging training situations. During her active duty career, some of her most effective teaching had happened in exactly these kinds of spontaneous, voluntary discussions. "Of course," she said. "What's on your mind?" Chen stepped forward, his expression reflecting both respect and curiosity. "Major, we've been talking about what we saw yesterday, and we realized we don't really understand how to prepare mentally for challenges like the Titan course. We train physically every day, but nobody's ever taught us how to train mentally." The question revealed a gap in the standard training program that Margaret had observed but hadn't directly addressed. Physical preparation was emphasized constantly, but the psychological aspects of performance were often left to individual discovery. "Mental preparation isn't mysterious," Margaret began, settling into what felt like a familiar teaching rhythm. "It starts with understanding that your brain is essentially a computer that can be programmed. Most people program it accidentally with doubt and anxiety. Elite performers program it deliberately with confidence and strategy." Morrison pulled out a small notebook, apparently intending to take notes. "How do you program it deliberately?" "Visualization, primarily, but not the kind most people think about. You don't just imagine success, you mentally rehearse every component of the challenge in detail. You practice perfect execution in your mind until your body recognizes the movements as familiar when you attempt them physically." Hayes leaned forward with obvious interest. "Is that what you were doing before you started the course yesterday? It looked like you were planning something." "Exactly," Margaret confirmed. I was mentally walking through each obstacle, calculating energy expenditure, identifying potential problem points, and rehearsing solutions. By the time I started moving, my brain had already completed the course successfully multiple times. The three recruits exchanged glances, clearly excited by this new perspective on preparation. Margaret found herself enjoying the teaching moment more than she'd expected, remembering why she'd been drawn to mentoring roles throughout her military career. But mental preparation is only half the equation, she continued. The other half is learning to read your body's feedback systems accurately. Most people interpret physical sensation as either comfort or discomfort, but elite performers learn to distinguish between productive stress and counterproductive stress. Chen looked puzzled. What's the difference? Productive stress is your body preparing for peak performance. Increased heart rate, heightened awareness, enhanced focus. Counterproductive stress is your body preparing for failure, muscle tension, scattered attention, self-doubt. Learning to recognize and redirect counterproductive stress is crucial for consistent performance. Morrison scribbled notes frantically. How do you redirect it? Breathing control, primarily. Most people breathe incorrectly under stress, which amplifies the stress response. Controlled breathing interrupts that cycle and allows you to reset your physiological state. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Kelly, who appeared in the doorway with an expression of mild amusement. "Major Sullivan," he said, "it looks like you've started an unofficial training seminar here." Margaret smiled ruefully. "Word travels fast on military bases, Sergeant." "That it does. Mind if I observe? I'm always interested in learning new training methodologies." The arrival of a senior NCO changed the dynamic slightly, but the recruits seemed eager to continue the conversation despite the additional oversight. "We were discussing mental preparation techniques," Margaret explained to Kelly. "These recruits were asking about psychological training approaches." Kelly nodded approvingly. "Excellent topic. Major, would you be willing to demonstrate some of these breathing techniques you mentioned?" Margaret found herself in an interesting position. She'd intended to maintain a low profile in her civilian role, but the teaching opportunity was proving irresistible. More importantly, she could see genuine hunger for learning in the recruits' faces. "Certainly," she said. "The foundation technique is what we call tactical breathing. It's designed to maintain optimal performance under stress." She guided the group through a series of breathing exercises, explaining the physiological principles behind each technique. Kelly watched with obvious professional interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his own advanced understanding of performance psychology. As the impromptu lesson continued, Margaret realized that something had fundamentally shifted in her relationship with Fort Mitchell. The careful anonymity she'd maintained for 18 months was gone, replaced by a new role that felt both familiar and challenging. By the time the session concluded, word had spread further through the base. Captain Torres reappeared, along with several other instructors who had heard about the informal training taking place in the supply depot. "Major," Torres said, as the recruits prepared to leave for their regular training schedule, "I think we need to have that conversation about evening sessions sooner than later. It looks like there's significant interest in this kind of training." Margaret looked around at the assembled faces. Recruits eager to learn, instructors curious about new methodologies, senior NCOs seeking ways to improve their programs. The teaching environment felt natural and necessary, but it also represented a commitment to greater visibility and engagement than she'd planned. "Let me finish my morning duties," she said finally, "and then we can discuss how to structure something that works for everyone." As the group dispersed, Margaret returned to her supply logs with mixed feelings. The morning had demonstrated that her expertise was needed and valued, but it had also pulled her back toward the kind of military role she'd thought she'd left behind. The question now was whether she could help these young soldiers without compromising the personal boundaries she'd established for her new life. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's demonstration, and Fort Mitchell had settled into a new rhythm. The evening training sessions she'd reluctantly agreed to facilitate had become the most sought-after developmental opportunity on the base. What had started as informal mentoring for struggling recruits had evolved into a comprehensive program that attracted personnel from multiple units. The transformation in the original group of skeptical recruits was remarkable. Corporal Hayes had not only mastered the Titan course, but had become an informal leader among his peers, sharing the mental preparation techniques Margaret had taught him. Private Morrison had overcome his rope traverse difficulties and posted his first successful course completion the previous week. Even Private Chen had discovered capabilities he'd never known he possessed, achieving times that placed him in the top quartile of his training cycle. But success, Margaret was learning, brought its own complications.
Colonel Daniel Harrison, Fort Mitchell's commanding officer, had requested a private meeting to discuss what he diplomatically termed the emerging training initiatives associated with Margaret's civilian position. Harrison was a career infantry officer with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for direct communication. His interest in Margaret's activities suggested developments beyond simple curiosity about training methods. Margaret arrived at Harrison's office precisely at 1400 hours, wearing her standard gray utility uniform but carrying herself with the bearing that 18 months of deliberate anonymity hadn't been able to completely suppress. Harrison's aide, a sharp young lieutenant named Walsh, showed her into the colonel's office with the kind of respectful deference that indicated word of her background had reached the highest levels of the base command structure. "Major Sullivan," Harrison said, rising from behind his desk and extending his hand. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me." The use of her former rank wasn't surprising, but the formal courtesy was. Margaret had expected a more casual conversation about her volunteer activities, not what appeared to be an official consultation. "Colonel Harrison," she replied, accepting his handshake and noting the firm grip of someone accustomed to dealing with military professionals. "How can I help you?" Harrison gestured toward a seating area away from his desk, suggesting a more collegial discussion than a formal briefing. "Major, I've been receiving some interesting reports about the training sessions you've been conducting. Lieutenant Colonel Vance and Master Sergeant Kelly speak very highly of your methods and the results you're achieving with our recruits." Margaret settled into the offered chair, maintaining the neutral professionalism that had served her well in countless military briefings. "The recruits have been working hard, Colonel. I'm just providing some additional perspective on mental preparation techniques." "Additional perspective," Harrison repeated with a slight smile. "That's a modest way to describe what amounts to a revolution in how our people approach physical challenges. Captain Torres tells me that course completion rates have improved by 43% since you started working with the struggling recruits." The statistic was impressive, but Margaret had expected significant improvement once the recruits learned proper mental preparation techniques. "Good training tends to produce good results, Colonel." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel capabilities. "Major, I'm going to be direct with you. I've been in contact with some colleagues who remember your service record. The feedback I've received suggests that you're operating considerably below your historical capacity in your current role." Margaret's expression didn't change, but she felt the familiar tension that came with having her past scrutinized by military leadership. "Sir, my service record is a matter of historical interest. My current position suits my present circumstances." "I understand that," Harrison said, "but I have a problem that your expertise might help solve, and I wanted to discuss it with you before making any formal requests." The conversation was taking a direction Margaret hadn't anticipated. She'd expected questions about her training methods, possibly concerns about unauthorized instruction activities. She hadn't expected to be consulted about operational problems. "What kind of problem, Colonel?" Harrison pulled a folder from the side table, opening it to reveal what appeared to be performance statistics and assessment reports. "Fort Mitchell has been selected to host a joint training exercise next month. Special Operations Command, Marine Force Recon, Navy SEALs, and selected international units will be participating in a comprehensive evaluation program." Margaret recognized the implications immediately. Joint exercises involving special operations forces are typically used to evaluate new training methodologies, equipment, or operational concepts. They were also opportunities for units to demonstrate their capabilities in competitive environments. The exercise will include modified versions of our current training courses, Harrison continued, but with significantly elevated difficulty levels. The Titan course will be one component, but there will also be urban warfare simulations, wilderness survival challenges, and integrated team operations. It sounds like an excellent opportunity for cross-training and capability development, Margaret said diplomatically. Harrison's expression grew more serious. Major, here's my problem. The other units participating in this exercise are sending their absolute best personnel. Teams that have been training together for years, individuals with extensive operational experience, groups that specialize in exactly these kinds of challenges. Margaret began to understand where the conversation was heading. And you're concerned about how Fort Mitchell's personnel will perform in comparison? I'm concerned that our people will be embarrassed, Harrison said bluntly, not because they lack capability, but because they lack the kind of integrated training and mental preparation that you've been demonstrating. What you've accomplished with our struggling recruits in 3 weeks suggests that our entire approach to physical and mental conditioning could be significantly improved. The compliment was genuine, but Margaret sensed an underlying request that she wasn't sure she was prepared to accommodate. Colonel, what exactly are you asking me to do? Harrison closed the folder and looked directly at her. I'm asking you to consider taking on a temporary consulting role to help prepare our personnel for this exercise. Nothing that would require you to change your civilian status, but something more comprehensive than the evening sessions you're currently conducting. Margaret felt the familiar pull of military challenges, combined with the equally familiar reluctance to fully re-engage with the world she'd deliberately left behind. What would that involve? Intensive training for our selected personnel, 48 individuals from various units who will represent Fort Mitchell in the competitive components of the exercise. The timeline is compressed, 4 weeks to bring them to a level where they can compete effectively with special operations professionals. The timeline was aggressive, but not impossible, assuming the selected personnel had solid fundamental fitness and were willing to commit to intensive preparation. Margaret's mind automatically began calculating training schedules, progression requirements, and psychological preparation protocols. Colonel, with respect, 4 weeks is a very short timeline to achieve the kind of performance improvements you're describing.
I understand that, Harrison replied. But Major, in 3 weeks, you've transformed recruits who were failing basic requirements into people who are exceeding established standards. If anyone can accomplish this kind of accelerated development, it's someone with your background and demonstrated capabilities. Margaret recognized the calculated appeal to her professional pride, but she also understood that Harrison's concern was legitimate. Joint exercises were evaluated by senior military leadership, and poor performance could have lasting implications for base personnel, training programs, and career advancement opportunities. "Who would I be working with?" she asked. Harrison handed her a personnel roster. Selected individuals from infantry, military police, intelligence, and support units. All volunteers, all currently meeting standard fitness requirements, all motivated to excel. Margaret scanned the list, recognizing several names from her evening training sessions. Corporal Hayes was included, as were Private Brooks and several others who had shown exceptional improvement under her guidance. "These are good people," she said. "But Colonel, the kind of training you're describing would require them to push beyond their current comfort zones significantly. Are they prepared for that level of intensity?" "That's what I'm hoping you can help them discover," Harrison said. "Major, I've seen the confidence improvements in the recruits you've been working with. They're not just performing better physically, they're thinking differently about their own capabilities." The observation was accurate. Margaret had noticed that her training sessions produced psychological changes that extended far beyond physical improvement. Recruits who learned to master challenging obstacles developed broader confidence in their ability to handle difficult situations. "Colonel, if I were to consider this, I would need complete authority over training methods and schedules. I would also need assurance that participants understand this is voluntary and that they can withdraw without prejudice if they find the intensity excessive." Harrison nodded immediately. "Absolutely. You would have full discretion over training design and implementation." Margaret studied the personnel roster again, her mind already beginning to formulate training progressions and assessment criteria. The challenge was intellectually appealing, and the opportunity to work with motivated personnel in an intensive environment reminded her of aspects of military service she genuinely missed. "I would need to maintain my current supply coordinator duties," she said. "Of course, we could arrange for additional administrative support to minimize conflicts." Margaret weighed the decision carefully. Accepting the consulting role would mean increased visibility, more extensive engagement with military operations, and a return to the kind of high-pressure training environment she'd stepped away from. But it would also mean helping young soldiers discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed, and potentially contributing to outcomes that could affect their careers and confidence. "Colonel, may I have 24 hours to consider this?" "Certainly. But Major, I want you to know that this isn't just about winning a competition. It's about showing our people what they're capable of achieving when they receive the right kind of preparation and leadership." After leaving Harrison's office, Margaret walked slowly back to the supply depot, processing the implications of the colonel's request. The proposed consulting role represented a significant step back toward military involvement, but it also offered the opportunity to work with motivated personnel in ways that could have lasting positive impacts. That evening's training session took on new significance as Margaret observed the participants with fresh eyes. The group had grown to include personnel from multiple units, all drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations from the original recruits. Their enthusiasm and dedication were evident, but Margaret also noted areas where more intensive training could produce dramatic improvements. Corporal Hayes approached her after the session concluded. "Major, some of us have been talking, and we were wondering if you'd be interested in working with a more advanced group, people who want to push beyond the basic course requirements." Margaret looked at the eager faces surrounding her, recognizing the hunger for challenge and development that characterized the best military personnel. "What did you have in mind, Corporal?" "We heard there might be some kind of special training opportunity coming up," Hayes said carefully. "We wanted you to know that if you're involved, we're interested in participating." The informal intelligence network that connected military personnel across unit boundaries had clearly been active. Margaret smiled at the familiar phenomenon of soldiers knowing about opportunities before they were officially announced. "I appreciate your interest," she said diplomatically. "If such opportunities arise, I'll certainly consider your enthusiasm and dedication." As the group dispersed, Margaret remained in the training area, looking out over the Titan course that had started this entire sequence of events. 3 weeks ago, she'd been an anonymous supply coordinator whose capabilities were unknown and unrecognized. Now she was being asked to prepare Fort Mitchell's best personnel for competition against Special Operations Forces. The irony wasn't lost on her, that her attempt to avoid military involvement had led to exactly the kind of high-profile training role she'd thought she'd left behind. But perhaps, she reflected, some aspects of service were too fundamental to abandon completely. The question now was whether she was ready to fully embrace that truth. 4 weeks later, Fort Mitchell buzzed with an energy that only comes when elite military units converge for serious competition. Black SUVs with government plates lined the parking areas. Helicopters delivered equipment and personnel throughout the morning. The joint training exercise that Colonel Harrison had worried about was no longer theoretical. It was happening, and Margaret's intensive preparation program was about to face its ultimate test. Margaret stood at the edge of the expanded course complex, watching teams from the Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and Army Special Operations Command conduct their final equipment checks. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the kind of elite professionals she'd once trained alongside. Operators whose reputations were built on consistently exceptional performance under the most demanding conditions. Beside her, the 48 Fort Mitchell personnel she'd spent the past month transforming prepared for what many considered an impossible challenge. But Margaret saw something in their bearing that gave her quiet confidence. The doubt and hesitation that had characterized their initial training sessions had been replaced by focused determination and genuine self-assurance. Corporal Hayes, now serving as the unofficial leader of the Fort Mitchell team, approached with the kind of calm professionalism that would have been unimaginable during their first encounter. "Major, the team is ready for the final briefing." Margaret nodded, noting how naturally the leadership role had emerged from Hayes's transformation over the past month. "Gather everyone together, Corporal. It's time." The intensive training program had pushed every participant beyond their previous limitations. Margaret had designed progressions that built not just physical capability, but the kind of integrated mental and physical conditioning that separated elite performers from merely competent ones. Sleep deprivation training, stress inoculation exercises, and advanced obstacle navigation had compressed years of development into weeks of focused effort. "Listen carefully," Margaret began, as the team assembled around her. "Today isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about demonstrating to yourselves what you've discovered you're capable of achieving." Private Brooks, who had volunteered for the most challenging training sequences, stepped forward. "Major, we want you to know that regardless of how we perform today, this month has changed how we think about everything. We're not the same people who started this program." Margaret smiled, recognizing the truth in Brooks' statement. The physical improvements had been dramatic, but the psychological transformation had been even more significant. These soldiers now understood that their limitations were largely self-imposed and that proper preparation could overcome obstacles that had previously seemed insurmountable. "Remember your breathing techniques," Margaret continued. "Remember that every obstacle is a problem to be solved, not an enemy to be defeated. Most importantly, remember that you've already proven your capabilities to the people whose opinions matter most, yourselves." The competition format included individual challenges, team events, and combined operations that tested everything from pure athleticism to tactical thinking under pressure. Margaret watched from the observation area as her people took their positions alongside some of the military's most elite operators. The opening event was an enhanced version of the Titan course, modified with additional obstacles and compressed timing requirements. Margaret's breath caught as she watched Corporal Hayes line up next to a Navy SEAL who had the kind of presence that commanded attention even in elite company. When the starting signal sounded, something remarkable happened. Hayes didn't just compete, he excelled, moving through the course with the fluid precision Margaret had spent weeks developing in him. His technique was flawless, his mental state controlled, his performance exceptional by any standard. But Hayes wasn't alone. Across multiple events, the Fort Mitchell personnel demonstrated capabilities that surprised even Margaret. Private Morrison, who had once struggled with basic rope traverses, completed an advanced climbing sequence faster than operators with years more experience. Private Chen executed precision movements with confidence that would have been inconceivable a month earlier. Master Sergeant Kelly, observing from the official evaluation area, found himself repeatedly checking results and comparing them to the performance standards he'd established over decades of training elite personnel. "Colonel," he said to Harrison, "I've never seen transformation like this. These aren't the same soldiers who started Sullivan's program." Harrison nodded, watching Private Brooks navigate a complex urban warfare simulation with tactical awareness that impressed even the special operations observers. "Master Sergeant, I'm beginning to understand that we may have underestimated what proper training can accomplish." The day's most challenging event was a team-based operation requiring coordination, communication, and individual excellence under extreme pressure. Teams had to navigate multiple obstacle sequences while maintaining radio contact and achieving specific timing objectives. Failure at any point meant starting over. Margaret watched her team's preparation with quiet pride. The group dynamics that had emerged during training were evident as they conducted final equipment checks and communication protocols. These weren't 48 individuals hoping to avoid embarrassment. They were a cohesive unit, confident in their collective capabilities. The performance that followed exceeded everyone's expectations, including Margaret. The Fort Mitchell team executed the complex sequence with precision that rivaled the special operations units, completing objectives within time standards that placed them among the top performers of the entire exercise. As the final scores were announced, Margaret felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with competitive rankings. Corporal Hayes had not only matched but exceeded the performance standards of operators with far more experience. Private Brooks had earned recognition for exceptional leadership under pressure. The entire team had demonstrated that with proper preparation and mental conditioning, ordinary soldiers could achieve extraordinary results. Colonel Harrison approached Margaret as the official ceremonies concluded. "Major Sullivan, I want to thank you for what you've accomplished here.
This wasn't just about competition, it was about showing our people what they're capable of achieving. Margaret looked out over the team she'd spent a month transforming, watching them interact with special operations personnel as equals rather than admirers. Colonel, they did the work. I just helped them understand what was already possible. Major, Harrison continued, I have to ask, would you consider making this arrangement permanent? Not just for special programs, but as a regular part of our training infrastructure? The question Margaret had been expecting finally arrived. The month of intensive training had demonstrated that her expertise could produce dramatic improvements in military performance, but it had also pulled her fully back into the world she'd deliberately left behind. Colonel, I appreciate the offer, but I think my greatest value lies in being available for situations like this one, special circumstances where intensive development is needed. The supply coordinator position allows me to observe and identify training needs while maintaining the flexibility to provide specialized assistance when necessary. Harrison smiled, recognizing the wisdom in Margaret's approach. Major, that might be even more valuable than a permanent instructional role. Sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected directions. As the visiting units departed and Fort Mitchell returned to its normal rhythm, Margaret found herself back in the supply depot, completing inventory reports with the same methodical attention she'd always brought to the task. But something fundamental had changed in how others perceived her role and how she understood her own contribution to the base's mission.
Corporal Hayes appeared in the doorway, still wearing his competition uniform, but carrying himself with new confidence. Major, I wanted to thank you for everything, but I also wanted to ask, when you first saw us struggling with the course, did you know we were capable of what we accomplished today? Margaret looked up from her paperwork, considering the question carefully. Corporal, I knew you had potential that wasn't being fully developed, but what you accomplished today went beyond potential. It demonstrated character, determination, and the willingness to push beyond comfortable limitations. Those qualities were always there. The training just helped you access them. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Major, some of the team has been talking, and we wanted you to know that we'd like to continue training together, not for competition, but for personal development. Would that be possible? Margaret smiled, recognizing that the month of intensive preparation had created lasting changes that extended far beyond the competition itself. I think that could be arranged, Corporal. Excellence is a habit, not an event. As Hayes departed, Margaret returned to her supply logs, surrounded by the familiar environment of her civilian role, but with a deeper understanding of how service could take many forms. The past month has demonstrated that sometimes the most valuable contributions come not from formal positions or official recognition, but from being ready to share expertise when and where it's needed most. Outside her window, the Titan course stood ready for the next group of recruits who would challenge its obstacles and discover their own capabilities. And in her modest office behind the supply depot, Major Margaret Sullivan, officially Miss Sullivan, supply coordinator, continued the work of serving others, knowing that the best kind of leadership often happens when no one is expecting it. The recruits had called her Grandma, assuming that age and civilian clothes meant diminished capability. Instead, they'd discovered that strength, wisdom, and excellence come in many forms, and that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people based on what we can see rather than what we know. Sometimes the person quietly pushing a supply cart has more to offer than anyone imagines. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who don't need to announce their credentials. And sometimes the most valuable lessons come from discovering that our limitations exist primarily in our minds, waiting to be overcome by proper preparation, mental discipline, and the willingness to push beyond what we think is possible. Margaret's story had come full circle, but in the best possible way, with young soldiers who now understood their own potential, and an organization that had learned to value capability wherever it appeared, regardless of rank, position, or initial appearances. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.